think I'm gonna go get some.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I want to go over some things again before I start talking about proteins tonight. So this will be in your packet next week. Keep in mind, this rumen functions at 102 degrees Fahrenheit. It is anaerobic, which means that there is very little oxygen. The bacteria are responsible for digesting feed, digest by attaching to the feed. So we talked about with carbohydrates. Anything we do to increase the surface area of the feed increases the number of bacteria that can attach. It increases the rate of digestion. Why is that really important when we're talking about not only about digestion but protein? Those bacteria that are in the rumen provide between 50 and 80% of the total protein available to the animal. On a high grain diet, because there's a greater concentration of them, it's about 80%. So I know this is reviewed from a little bit from the first night. So with the forage-based diet, there are approximately 1 to 3 billion bacteria per milliliter of rumen contents. With a grain-based diet, because there is no lignin, there's about 8 to 10 billion bacteria per milliliter of rumen contents. Okay. Okay. In addition, there are to the bacteria, there are protozoa that swallow soluble sugars and starch. They're normally about 1 to 10 million, and there are some rumen fungi that work to break the lignin cellulose bonds. And I'll show you a picture of what those look like. So this thing that looks like a finger is a picture of a rumen fungi. Now, even though there's only about 10,000 of them per milliliter rumen contents, what these do is they actually grow into the forage in the rumen like tree roots grow into the ground. They actually are able to secrete enzymes that break the lignin bond with cellulose. And the way I try to explain lignin and cellulose so that it makes sense is, think of a block wall. If the blocks themselves are the sugars, the cellulose that's digestible, lignin is that non-digestible component that makes up the mortar that holds the plant together. So with young forage, we have less lignin. With wood, we have a lot of lignin. So the reality of it is that these are kind of cool because these things here are the bacteria. That's just a good representation of the relative size differences. This is a species of bacteria that digest forage called Rumenacoccus albus. This is Rumenacoccus flavifaciens. So there's just different types of bacteria, but they're carried in the cellulose, and that the mortar is broken up by the fungi themselves. Okay, another review. If we have a 15-gallon rumen and I've got a forage diet, I get about 170 trillion bacteria. If I have a grain-based diet with 8 billion bacteria per milliliter rumen contents, you can see just how many more there are. This is why, with a grain diet, we have to supplement forage with more protein in many cases than we do with grain-based diets. Because with grain-based diets, we're getting more bacteria making it to the small intestine. So the great irony from a beef extension specialist viewpoint is every feedlot in America supplements protein. We formulate diets so that they're 12.5 to 13.5% protein. We limit a lot of animal performance, especially with stocker cattle. When that protein in that forage goes down to 8 to 9%, well, that is the bare minimum really for rumen function. So we're really limiting growth. So I'm going to talk over tonight and next week a little bit more about how important protein is and what we need to do to make things operate in a system that's more efficient. And we may be talking about this slide for a little while. The way it looks.
So when you're talking about forages, are you talking about foliage, silage?
Foliage, silage, grass, alfalfa, hay, anything that is derived from grass, I call it forage. Okay. So this is just a picture of the rumen, the reticulum, the omasum, and the abomasum, the four compartments of the ruminant's predigestive system. So things I want you to keep in mind, because I think it's important to review this stuff. The rumen contents average 88% water. That means they average 12% dry matter. That means for every 1 pound of dry feed intake, it takes 7 pounds of water. Now, the ruminant animal is able to recirculate water pretty effectively, and we'll talk about that here in a second. Okay. So keep in mind, this is what a healthy rumen papillae should look like. They ought to be 3/4 of an inch long approximately. They ought to have plenty of space between them, because the more space between them, the more VFAs they can absorb, because those volatile fatty acids that are produced, they're volatile, but they're soluble in that rumen fluid. And this is the reticulum. How many of you have tried tripe? How many of you have liked tripe? Okay, good. That's a pretty good. I always kind of think of tripe just like I do calamari. If you put marinara sauce with it, it tastes like marinara sauce. That's personal.
You haven't had my mama's fried tripe.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
I am open to experimentation.
Okay.
If anyone wants to bring anything that they think I need to try, because I haven't tried it, look at me. I'm your best kitchen model.
We need to do a tripe supper out at the station sometime.
Okay, that'd be pretty fun. Maybe a September tripe supper.
Yeah.
Okay. So the reticulum traps things that are about the size of a kernel of corn. Now, I know this is supposedly a feedlot school, but it's really a feeding school. And it's really a ruminant nutrition school. You didn't know that when you signed up for it, but that's what it is. So what I want you to think of is when we have hay out there and it's not chop cut and the particle is this long, that animal has to break it down to this long before it can get out. And the average particle of forage leaving the rumen is 1/25 of an inch long. That's pretty small. It takes a lot of energy to regurgitate that feed, re-chew it, to get it down to that size. Okay. So, feed particles must be broken down to 2 to 5 centimeters to pass out of the rumen. Long stem hay drastically reduces digestibility and energy intake as the animal expends energy ruminating, regurgitating, and re-chewing the feed. So anything we can do from a forage particle standpoint to reduce its size increases the amount of energy that that animal can eat in a day if it's on a forage diet. If you've got like a grower yard where you are growing your calves post-weaning to take them to 800 pounds, and you have a round bale out there and you're supplementing with feed, you're costing yourself a lot more money than you would if you were able to break that forage particle down so that what they were eating went in at 4 inches to 6 inches. Ideally, in a feedlot situation with a high grain diet, I want forage broken down to 1.5 inches. That is my optimum size. That takes a lot of machinery to do it. But the reality of it is, you can save 35% of your total forage requirements to meet that animal's energy needs if you take the same quality forage and you break it down to 4 to 6 inches from where it would be at, say, 2 feet in length. And the reason for that is the animal's guts expand the longer the forage is. That's how we get hay belly. And that forage that is indigestible, if it's more mature, it's not going to be digested by the bacteria if it's really mature, if it's got a lot of lignin. If it is on a pasture that is let's say a stockpile pasture that's 8 to 9% protein, and you're not supplementing protein, there's not enough protein in that forage to actually meet the requirements of the animal for growth or to optimize the rumen fermentation. And when you get a printout, and I'll say this again the next talk, but I want you to understand it. When you get a printout of a forage analysis or a feed analysis, and it says % crude protein, the way they determine that is you boil that feed sample in concentrated sulfuric acid. You boil it in the nitrogen and release and capture it. But the reality of it is, the important thing on a feed analysis, I never use % crude protein to balance a diet when I am looking at a feed sample. I look at available crude protein, because that's the only thing that matters to the animal. And with many of our forages, that available crude protein is 15 to 20% less than total crude protein, which means if I think that I am supplementing an animal so that it has a 12% protein diet, and I don't know where that became magical, but it did, sometimes in the 50s. It was just a nice round number, I guess. But the reality of it is, we formulate diets a lot of times to be around 12% protein. Well, if that forage has 20% less protein and we're using 12, and the available percentage of protein from that forage is 10, we are limiting our animals' growth. And I will show you some examples of that tonight. So, after that feed gets out of the reticulum, it goes into the abomasum. And the abomasum, to me, is probably the coolest organ in a ruminant, because it's just like a volleyball that you cut down the middle and it opens up like a book. This is the organ that keeps these cattle from constantly having diarrhea, because this is the organ responsible for resorbing the fluid that is coming to it. Now here's the thing, if you are feeding dry hay, that animal can produce as much saliva in its day as equal to its entire rumen volume. So the more forage you have in the diet, the more saliva you have. The more saliva you have, the more buffering capacity, because there's sodium and potassium salts in that saliva that brings that pH up, which is why when we're feeding a forage diet, that pH is around 6.5 to 7. The reality of it is, though, what we do for forage when we switch to grain and we don't have as much forage in the diet, we're feeding a finishing diet that's probably only got 10% fiber. And then we break it down. So you don't get nearly as much saliva production. It's a good thing in some ways, because if you remember what I said on carbohydrates, that rumen, if we think of it as a barrel with a tube coming in and a tube going out, the reason we don't feed more forage on a high grain diet, the reason I don't like round bales with a feed bunk, is because when they eat that round bale, they're producing more saliva. They're washing the grain out faster. How many of you are completely lost at this point? Raise your hand happily. Okay. Me too. Okay. The reality of this is it's very complex in some ways, but in other ways it's very simple. We just have to remember a couple things. Bacteria digest feed by attaching to them. Grain doesn't have lignin, so it's digested very fast. When we have forage, on the other hand, with lignin, we want to break that particle down as much as we can so that we don't just get a buildup of feed in the rumen that takes a lot of energy to get out. Okay, this is the abomasum. This is the same as our stomach. It produces pepsin and it produces hydrochloric acid, and the pH runs around a 2 to 3. It's very acidic. The other night when I talked about calves that were very nervous, those cattle that go from side to side, cattle get ulcers too. It's something that we need to understand. If you're working your cattle really rough too, they can get an ulcer. They're a species that they're not quite as bad as sheep from a herding standpoint. If any of you have ever worked with sheep, how many of you have? Oh, you're the fortunate ones in here. If you put sheep in a pen the size of this room and you walk in that door, they will go out of their way to kill each other in the other corner sometimes. They have a huge herding instinct. Cattle are similar, not quite as bad. But the reality of it is, when we work them, when we're talking loud like I am here, when we're pushing them, that makes them very nervous. And we do see ulcers that sometimes manifest themselves looking like acidosis. But what we really can create ulcers in these cattle, and we just have to be conscious of that fact and work them as calmly as possible. Okay, this is just a picture of the stomach, a close-up of the hydrochloric acid and the pepsin secretion sites. It's very slimy. If you work calves, let's say that you get a bunch of cattle, how many of you buy calves from somewhere else and feed them? Not hardly anyone. You're producing them and sending them somewhere. Let me tell you the flip side of that. If I'm in Kansas and I buy your calves and they come in and it's been a rough ride, if the trucker has been really breakneck and they've been worked hard loading, the reality of it is that when they get off, that manure is going to be really, really slimy that first 2 days. That's the lining of the intestines from the abomasum on. That's why we can tell when cattle get off a truck looking at the manure within the first 2 hours or so how rough they've been. We don't need to go in the truck and see how much urine there is. If they're on a truck for 12 hours, they're going to urinate. But we look in when they start to have manure once they get off the truck. We can look at that as an indication of just how stressed they are. You can do it on your own farm too when you get done working calves if they've been worked really, really hard. Okay. So, this is the thing that I keep referring back to. Remember that the rumen contents average 88% water, means 1 pound of dry matter. It takes 7 pounds of water. Do you think that's important in a state with heat stress? Where it gets up to 100 degrees?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, really does. And regardless of which weather extreme, this plays a huge role. Okay. So, I asked how much energy it takes to take this to this. A lot. A lot. Okay. So, what happens when cattle have to drink cold water? How many of you send your calves to a feedlot somewhere and have retained ownership? Okay, some of you have. Here's the problem that we have in the Midwest and then the upper Midwest when it gets really, really cold. Cattle have a hard time drinking this. Okay, the reason I went to college is because I'm from Ohio, and we had a pond that in the winter looked like this, and it was about 350 yards from the house, and that was my job from the time I got to be about 10 or 11 years old. There is nothing scarier than a herd of cattle running down a hill in snowy, icy area when you are here on the edge, breaking the ice, and they haven't had a drink since yesterday. That will make you either slide across the pond really fast as they bump you gently, or you learn to go like this really fast with a spud bar. Okay, here's the reality. Imagine that the calves that you sent to Kansas or Nebraska or Iowa are in a feedlot, and it's 15 degrees outside, and that water's not heated. When water in feedlots, there's a couple different kinds. A lot of modern waters are heated. A lot of them are circulating, though, to keep the water from freezing. A lot of feedlots have circulating water systems. They keep water moving. It's just like why if it's going to freeze, you leave your faucet drip, just in case power goes off. Here's the problem with the circulating water. It may still be down around 40 degrees or 38 degrees, like your refrigerator. The problem is that rumen operates at 101 to 102 degrees. And if those animals are eating 20 pounds of feed, they're still drinking 3 to 5 gallons of water a day. So what I want you to imagine is, I want you to imagine a 24-hour time period, and now I've got a vat of rumen contents that's about 15 to 20 gallons. And I pour 5 gallons of water in it that is at 38 to 40 degrees. How does that water heat up? It heats up because that animal blood flow now is going more to the interior versus the exterior. And it takes 5 to 6 hours to warm that up. But those bacteria, they're just kind of on standstill when it drops below about 100 degrees. When it's there, they're alive, but they're not actively digesting the way they would be if it were 102 degrees. So what happens in those situations is we may only be actively digesting feed in those feedlot situations 18 hours a day, not 20. So management of water is a really big thing in feedlots in the north. Okay, Keith. What happens in the south? Where you're not worried necessarily about what happens to those calves when they get on the truck and they leave. But you get your cow herd out here and they're in the ponds in the summer. Is that a good thing? You can look at this two ways. They cool themselves. How clear is that water when you have cows laying in it?
Nasty.
Yeah, it's nasty. When you walk in a farm pond and your feet go down a foot in that silty stuff and they're kicking it up. I used to work with a fellow who did pesticide work, but he looked at pesticides in earthworms. Interesting thing is, a lot of our farms had different uses 50 years ago. If you had an orchard, for instance, in an area that is now pasture, and they used the chemicals 50, 60 years ago to spray the orchard, many of those chemicals have half-lives of 1,000 years. And where do they get absorbed? They get absorbed by the earthworms. Where does runoff take that? It takes them to the pond areas, unless it is just spring-fed. So there's a lot of stuff in that silt in a pond you may not want cattle consuming. Okay, Keith. The other things is that your grasses are drier in a drought. And we have this is our biggest problem. Total dissolved solids. It's just a measure of those particles that are in suspension in that water. And if your total dissolved solids in the water increase to levels above 5,000 parts per million, that should not be used for pregnant or lactating cows. Here's the problem. If it's August here and those cows are in a pond, and that pond is constantly muddy, and you don't have a water development so that they're drinking clean water, many times it is at that 5,000 level. That to me is really concerning, because when you get to a level of 10,000, it can kill cattle. Now, I want you to picture that rumen that we saw a little bit ago with all the papillae. Now, imagine that those cattle are drinking water from the pond for 2 months. That silt was heavy. That's the reason it sunk. The little particles are heavy. They go to the bottom of the rumen. They can fill up the spaces between the papillae. So you can actually do a necropsy on a cow and cut the rumen open, and sometimes you will see this if the cow dies in August or so. If they're in this situation, you will see the rumen filled with muddy slime at the bottom. So that is something that doesn't happen in a normal condition, but we have to understand that it can happen. Okay, I'm going to kill myself on this. This cord over here was put here just to show that I have no hand-foot coordination, eye-foot coordination. Okay, so the implications of this water in the winter or drought, the lack of fresh water limits feed intake. We have to try to get around that. In cold water, we're trying to heat it to 102 degrees. Oh, I was just teasing Keith. I'll fall on my own. I've seen me do it. And in hot weather, we have to provide a clean source of water. That is the major thing I want you hearing, that some people don't want to hear, that clean source of water is a huge thing. Okay. That was it. Any questions on that little overview of physiology before we get into protein nutrition?
We were showing pictures, like that second picture right there, where it's so full of that, it looks like mush.
This right here,
Yeah, is that a good thing or a bad thing? All that
that's corn silage.
So is that good or bad?
It ain't that, okay? That's the way they look like when you take them to a slaughter plant, if they've eaten the day before, that's what they look like. Yep, that's normal. And you can grab that stuff and just squeeze water right out of it. Okay, let's put up another question.
Well, yeah, you're talking about the length of the hay.
Yeah,
And you know, in Georgia especially, you'll have dry and then it might rain, and that first cutting that, you know, is got 5-6 weeks on it of age before you cut it. I mean, how much different and harder is it on them in digestive, that versus 4-week hay? And in other words, and if you took that sorry hay and somehow chopped it, would it make it better hay
it
for them?
makes it a lot better.
Even if it's sorry hay?
Even if it's sorry hay. The sorrier the hay, the more good you do by breaking the particle size down. And I'll get you just a second. Hay belly is nothing more than indigestible hay that is stuck in that rumen. And that sorry hay, that hay that's been out there growing in its 5 weeks, and it was probably went into head 3 weeks earlier, and now you're building up lignin. The protein level is falling. Tammy, what do you see as protein levels in a lot of those forages that are really mature?
Oh, 7 or 8%.
7 or 8%. And the book value that is used commonly for the rumen to function is 8 to 9%. So the reality of it is that I think people really need to understand, if you're trying to background calves and you're trying to put weight on them, and you're not supplementing with protein, and you don't know the protein level of your forage, it doesn't matter how good the genetics are. The reality of it is, when feedlots buy them, what is compensatory growth? Compensatory growth is that 4-week period in a feedlot when we're buying those skinny calves that have been deprived of protein. Not so severely deprived of protein that they can't recover, but they've been eating feed that is 8 or 9% protein, and they have the genetics to grow, and they're just waiting for groceries. Now, you could have given them the groceries, and you'd make the particle sizes smaller of the forage. If you, even with a chocolate baler that takes it down to here, and you supplement them with some protein, you can get growth out of those calves. In feedlots, we see efficiencies for healthy calves that come in, that don't get sick. We can see efficiencies of 3.5 pounds of feed per pound of gain for that first month. What do? We feed them 14 to 17% protein diets that are about half corn. We're putting energy to them, and we're putting protein to them. And the muscles just bloom because they've been deprived. And when calf prices are $2.50 a pound, you can afford a little protein to make sure that those animals have the opportunity to reach their genetic potential. Because you can either put on that extra 50 pounds down here, or we'll put it on a feedlot early, like within 3 weeks.
So what about the protein in like the licks tank? How's that protein different than your soybean meal there?
You are a great setup woman. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Good.
That's what I'm talking about now.
Okay.
Protein nutrition. I can promise you one thing, and this I know. We misunderstand protein utilization in ruminants at the farm level more than anything else. Because we've kind of been told things that may sell product but may not be totally true. So, kids. Back to chemistry. I love chemistry. This was my favorite 2 years, this class. This is what an amino acid looks like. There is an amino group, ammonia. It combines with a hydrogen in the rumen because the rumen has free hydrogen, makes it an NH3. That becomes ammonia. Ammonia is what all rumen bacteria uses their source of protein. That's something that we'll talk about. This C double bond OH is an acid unit. This part breaks off and combines with another carbon and another hydrogen and can create